What up, Dan? And in for Amy is Chicago Tribune columnist John Cass this morning. John, President Trump at the Kennedy Center over the weekend, speaking at a Celebrate Freedom rally, which is appropriate given the weekend. And here's what he had to say about the media in those remarks.
The fake media is trying to silence us, but we will not let them. Because the people know the truth. The fake media tried to stop us from going to the White House, but I'm president and they're not.
Oh boy.
We won and they lost. The fact is, the press has destroyed themselves because they went too far. Instead of being subtle and smart, they used a hatchet. And the people saw it right from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, once he's done with the presidency, he can, challenge Mike Wolf. Michael Wolf for media criticism. But
this is wrestling. This is, on both sides, the CNN nonsense and Trump's nonsense is.
Well, the question is he at least half right, even if he's living in a bit of a glass house, as you suggest? To help us address that question, we're pleased to be joined by award-winning investigative journalist, author of the new book, The Smear: How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. She is Sharyl Attkinson. Sharyl, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Do we have Sharyl? Hello, Sharyl.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry, we didn't have you for a second. Thanks so much. So is Trump right in his criticism of the media that they've turned themselves into caricatures of themselves?
Well, in some cases, yes, we have. I mean, I think by announcing we were against him explicitly in some cases and then exempting ourselves publicly from the normal rules of journalism because we said he was so dangerous, we put our own reputations at risk. And some of what's happened, you've seen resulting, which is reporting that is 180 degrees incorrect and false sometimes from some of the most once well-respected news organizations, editorial bias that has crept into what used to be fact-based news reporting. And I think all of that is harmful to our public reputation for sure.
Sharyl, my problem with the media, even though I'm a member of the media, is after the WikiLeaks examination or leaks of the DNC collusion with members of the Beltway media to, the Donna Brazil leaking and so forth, and reporters vetting their stories with Democratic officials, I found that there's never been a come-to-Jesus moment after that to examine it and see the effects. And all we've done as a media culture is jump from that to the attack on Trump, which undercuts the credibility of many journalists who are just trying to do their job.
Bingo. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I spent a whole chapter in the book reprinting some of these WikiLeaks emails, also some emails between the media and campaign officials as exposed by Freedom of Information Act requests. And I have the same response you did. After Trump was elected, I thought there would be somewhat of a mea culpa and a reexamination on our part in the news media. How did we get it so wrong? How did we miss what was really happening? And so on. And instead, we in the media said we were going to do a reexamination, but instead we doubled down on this behavior. And I think Trump was right when he says that if we had been subtle, I mean, I think this was an implication, it might have worked better. In other words, there's plenty of legitimate criticism to make, and I absolutely think powers that be should be held accountable and answer tough questions. But you don't have to go overboard and risk your own credibility by making big mistakes and going too far. Now people won't believe anything we have to say, even when true at times.
And that's the danger for the Republic.
Well, and it's interesting. There's a piece by James Bowman in the new Criterion, the column he writes on the media. And he mentions this discussion he had with a former New York Times reporter and how that outlet operated much differently than previous newspapers that this reporter had worked for. It was very editor-driven, and it was very narrative-driven. So if an idea incubated from the reporter up to the editors, the conversation was about whether that idea and potential story fit the narrative, essentially, that the editors wanted to tell, or it didn't. And it seems to me that that philosophy has now bled into other outlets that form kind of the D.C. press corps.
Well, I wrote about this extensively in my book Stonewalled in 2014.
Yes, you did.
That was one of the main reasons I left CBS News ahead of my contract. As I described, managers would develop these little novelettes in their head of what they wanted a story to say and what the interviewee should say. This is not just at CBS. This is at all news organizations, or many of them. And then you would be assigned, instead of bringing the facts, of going out and fulfilling their idea of what a story would be, even if it didn't fit with the truth. So you'd come back as the reporter on the ground and say, I know you said the car was red, or you read that on Associated Press, but the car is blue, and I'm looking at it. And they would say, well, that's all well and good, but make the car red. And if it didn't fit what they wanted the story to say, they would literally say, go find a character to say X, meaning go find someone to interview who will say the following words out of their mouth. And if you didn't fulfill that, which, a lot of times reporters didn't want to, if it wasn't factually correct, you don't want to make people say things, then they didn't want to air the story. And you were seen as, sort of a troublemaker by those people that wanted the narratives fulfilled.
The high concept story where the editors decide what the news should be is definitely a problem. But on the other hand, editors do have to be able to set some sort of, marching orders, something where they're trying, to explain to reporters what story they're looking for, right?
Well,
I think in the, yes, go on, please. I'm interested in what you think.
No, I think that worked very well for years, and the way I worked at CNN, PBS, CBS, local news. I mean, I was a kind of reporter, more original and investigative reporting, so I more often than not told them what I found. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes, yes, there'd be, we need to explain topic X, and we need to, and this is perfectly legitimate, we need to explore this facet that hasn't been well done and do it in simple terms. But that's typically what was done for many years, which is what you're describing. I think that's absolutely appropriate. But the micromanaging, that is being described by reporters at news outlets now, and putting words in people's mouth contrary to the facts. When you literally come back from the field, and reporters do this now, or we're doing this when I was at CBS, and say, that's not true. They still want it. And they hate it when you say that. But, we would even use those words, because how are they going to then say, put it on TV? But then they find a reason that the story just doesn't fit in the newscast that night.
I'm always interested in standards when we talk about conduct in a particular sector. So you have something to measure how people are behaving professionally or otherwise against something. And so the topic of using anonymous sources, particularly you, Sharyl, as an investigative reporter, I'm sure you are, you come into contact with people who don't want their name disclosed but have valuable information. Can you give us the standard for using anonymous sourcing and how that has changed in the Trump era, if it has changed?
Yes, it's changed. And there's no law, of course. This is all what we decide in our profession. My primary use of anonymous sources is just to get other information. It's not to go on air with, but occasionally you do. But at CBS, what we were told, and I would discuss this with the CBS attorneys, all my stories I wasn't required to, but I ran my investigative stories by our attorneys and discussed them at length. And anonymous sources generally were to be used only if you couldn't find any other way to source somebody. They absolutely couldn't have their name used. And then had to be a good reason, of course. And then you had to explain the reason. In other words, you had at least in a line say that they're affiliated with such and such and they fear retaliation. And then you had to describe as best you could the position that they held or why they're an authority on the topic without, revealing too much. So anonymous use of sources is supposed to be very rare, well explained, and well justified. Now, as you've seen, not only are we using anonymous sources over and over again, we're using anonymous sources that are proving wrong over and over again, like the ones who said, Comey never told President Trump 3 times he wasn't under investigation. Well, Comey testified he did do that. So, that's just one example of probably a half dozen off the top of my head. And yet these apparently same anonymous sources, or at least the same reporters who turn to them, continue to operate with apparent, impunity.
I'm reminded during that whole episode with CNN and the 3 times Comey didn't say, and he was going to come on and testify that Trump was a liar, and then they had to change their story again. I'm reminded that I wrote a column last week about this. The motivation, I don't want sources to be identified by name, but I think that the public is owed an understanding of the political motivation of the sources. I just think that's critical, particularly when they're intelligence leak sources where, you got to think, where is it coming from, why, and let the people in on the game, because when they're not let in on the game, they tend to lose belief in our credibility.
I think that's part of the responsibility in using an anonymous, politically based source in justifying their anonymity and explaining their position. I think that's part of the characterization that ought to be made as much as possible.
But before we let you go, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of recast some advice you gave to people trying to make sense of what's factual and what is not, what is well-sourced and what is not. This is from an interview you gave last week on Fox News Channel. But in terms of advice you have for individuals to separate truth from fiction, or at least well-sourced stories from those that are not.
I hate to say I don't have easy answers, but original sourcing, watching a hearing or news conference yourself is always the best, but who has time to do that? But I do think when you see common narratives and phraseology emerging across platforms and news organizations, when there are literally thousands of stories that could legitimately be covered in a given day, but we're selecting the same 3 or 4, interviewing the same people, using the same phrases, trust your, thinking and think to yourself, someone may be pushing a narrative. And if you read the book, you'll see how this is done. And then ask yourself, not only is it true, perhaps maybe it's not, but what are they trying to deflect from? Because one of the main purposes of narratives is at times to deflect attention from something serious that they don't want you to look at. So I just think asking those questions, and if you're like me, I literally believe almost nothing I hear at first report until I can verify or get more information, because so much of it is proven to be 180 degrees wrong. So I think healthy skepticism is more important than ever.
She is Sharyl Attkinson. She's an investigative journalist and the author of the new book, The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. Sharyl, thanks as always for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thank you for having me.
And she joined us on the turnkey.pro answer line.